Hello. This is the sixth video about the theory of incomplete measurements, and the last high-level one. In earlier videos, we saw a quick overview of the theory of incomplete measurements. After seeing them, you are probably starting to get a feeling for how this new theory relates to quantum mechanics. In the present video, we will focus on relativity, and introduce a new extended principle of relativity. Einstein's theory of relativity starts with a principle, the principle of relativity, which states that the laws of physics should be the same, irrespective of the observer's state of motion. For example, the movement of a point on a wheel appears circular for someone who sits in the car. But this is not the only way to describe that movement. If you are sitting outside of the car, you may see a different trajectory. And if the car is traveling relative to you, you will observe yet another trajectory. The principle of relativity states that all these viewpoints are equally valid. This is called a principle because it is not an observation, but a choice. More specifically, we want laws of physics to be as general and as universal as possible. A consequence is that more general physical laws must depend on more context. For example, in the case of the car, the context includes the speed and orientation of the car. The laws describing the motion of the point on the wheel depends on transformations which take that information into account. In the case of Einstein's theories, the context is the state of motion, which Einstein called a referential. Before Einstein, laws of physics already included transformations for the position based on the speed, which are the transformations we applied for the point on the car wheel. However, these transformations preserved lengths and durations. Time and space were absolute, identical for everyone, something that Newton described as true space and true time. Einstein, on the other hand, had to incorporate a newly discovered observation, the constancy of the speed of light. This requires another way to adjust the laws of physics between referentials, called the Lorentz transformation. A consequence is that space and time are no longer absolute. This leads to surprising effects, such as time dilation and space contraction. We will discuss these effects in another video. General relativity extended the idea to accelerated motions, leading to somewhat more complicated transformations. In short, a principle of relativity describes a desirable property of the laws of physics, from which we can deduce the correct form of transformations from one observer to another. The theory of incomplete measurements could have been called extended relativity, because it makes the principle of relativity even more general. The extended principle states that laws of physics should be invariant, irrespective of the measurement devices being used. In other words, laws of physics shouldn't remain invariant only when you move, but also when your voltmeter is broken or when fog blurs your vision. Like for Einstein's formulation of the principle, this has consequences. We now need to document which measurement is used when we describe an experiment. And we also need transformations similar to Lorentz transformation to go from one measurement to another. As we will see in another video, this includes many new interesting cases, like damaged instruments or even someone cheating. But first, let us describe the problem that the extended relativity principle addresses. Newton's equation for the second law of motion does not explain how you are supposed to measure F, m or a, the variables that representing force, mass and acceleration. It just assumes that in any experiment, there is only one force, one mass and one acceleration. In other words, we are talking about the force applied to the object, as if there was only one way to measure it, or as if all methods to measure this quantity were exactly equivalent. Similarly, we are talking about the mass and the acceleration of the object. This is not just the case in this particular equation. In classical physics, we never specify how we measure something. The assumption is that it is irrelevant. More precisely, to follow Newton's reasoning in the scholium of the Principia, the assumption is that there is one single objective value, and that our measurements are simply approximations of that ideal value. You may remember from an earlier video that Newton talks about the true time and true space, as opposed to the vulgar time and space we measure with clocks and feet. Modern physicists today still see the measured mass, force or acceleration as a mere vulgar approximation of the one true mass, force or acceleration. There is a very interesting piece of science history that further highlights the problem. We will call this story rods of metal versus beams of light. If you read Einstein's work, you may notice that he keeps talking about rods when he refers to space coordinates. Why is that so? Well, back in Einstein's days, the definition of the meter was a solid rod of metal held in Paris, called meter etalon. The story of that rod and of the meter is quite illuminating. Try to find the time to read about it. What interests us here is that in 1961, the scientific community decided to shift to another definition of the meter, one that is based on properties of light. No big deal, right? It's just more precise. It's just a slightly less vulgar measurement of the ideal meter. In other words, whether you define it using light or using some metal reference, a meter is a meter. It is the same length with light or with a piece of metal, right? Not so fast. Let us examine what happens if we consider not 1, but 40 million meters. Specifically, what happens in our daily environment, the surface of the Earth. Obviously, rods are made of metal, and that metal bends ever so slightly under the influence of gravity. So if you put 40 million 1-meter rods back to back, you end up with a ring around the Earth, and since the circumference of the Earth is 40,000 kilometers, you basically return where you came from. Historically, the meter was defined so that the circumference of the Earth would be exactly 40,000 kilometers. Didn't we tell you that it was an interesting story? Well, this is not the case with light. If you use the laser beam in order to measure 40 million meters, the beam shoots straight into space. There is no ring, it never returns at the original spot. So now we have two definitions of the meter that wildly differ in their predictions in the presence of gravity, due to some curvature effect. Here is why it gets thorny. Einstein's general relativity is all about curvature. It also talks about rods to measure space, so it is clearly rooted in the definition of the time. Yet our little thought experiment shows that the actual curvature changes depending on whether you use the 1915 or 1961 definition of the meter. Which definition does Einstein's equations apply to? If you look at Einstein's theory, is the X in the equations made of solid rods of metal, or of beams of light? The answer is surprising. Einstein's theory actually does not work with the definition of the meter at the time it was written. That extra curvature in space caused by properties of platinum-iridium alloys is nowhere to be found in Einstein's equations. They work much better with the 1961 definition. Should we conclude that the definition was altered to make Einstein's theory actually work? That seems a bit far-fetched. The theory presented here comes to the rescue to explain how to resolve that paradox. The theory of incomplete measurements reverses the paradigm entirely. It states that physics is all about observations. The fact that observations may be partial, incomplete, or include some bias does not invalidate them. It only means we need our physical laws to deal with such situations. In the theory presented in these videos, this is done using a mathematical tool called probavectors, which give us statistical information. We are used to different instruments giving different results. It's all very usual. If your scale and my scale give us different masses, we never claim that laws of physics are broken. Instead, we simply end up with measurements that have some uncertainty. We simply brought the kind of problems seen in quantum mechanics into the realm of large-scale physics. The good news is that we know very well how to deal with such scenarios, because they are part of our everyday life. We all had to clean up foggy glasses to see better. We all had to flip a switch multiple times to conclude that the light bulb is broken. Bad measurements are simply a normal fact of life, and we know how to correct them. We simply need to formalize this intuitive knowledge. The same is true with Einstein's work. Both metal rods and beams of light are valid measurements, but they do not exactly measure the same thing. We need an additional transformation between the two. And for reasons discussed more precisely in another video, it is reasonable to postulate that Einstein's equations actually apply to light in a vacuum, and that our understanding of space of time derives entirely from properties of photons. In Einstein's theories, Lorentz transformation explains how to convert space and time coordinates from one observer to another. We will see in another video that these equations are actually very similar to rotations. For now, suffice it to say that they are part of a larger class of mathematical transforms that we use when we model how to move from one viewpoint to another. We need something similar for propavectors. Well, it turns out that computer scientists have long devised schemes that perform similar transformations on propavectors. What you see on the screen is not a plane with a flower that rotates, moves back and forth, or moves sideways. It is all computations that transform one propavector containing the picture of the flower in order to project it on the screen propavector in a way that is similar to the effect of physical movement. Let's consider a simple case. Here, the picture appears to move on the screen. However, your screen itself does not move. The computer does not move either. Only data from the propavector moves in memory. The net result on the propavector for screen photons is, however, exactly the same as if a physical object moved. The case of scaling is interesting. When we scale down a picture, we lose information. The resulting propavector uses less memory in the computer. When we scale that back up, however, we get a blurry picture, and there is more than one way to scale up. Some of the transformations we are discussing are not reversible, unlike all tensor mathematics and Einstein's work. The algorithms being considered here are also much more general than Einstein's equations. For example, in general relativity, equations take into account the effect of gravity on light. The equations do not include the frequency of the photons, however. On the other hand, many mediums are said to be dispersive, in that they impact light differently depending on its frequency. This is how we get rainbows. The propavectors we capture using modern digital cameras do include frequency information, since we have separate propavectors for red, green, and blue primary colors. We can build transformations that move propavectors differently based on photon frequency. Modern software exists that attempts to compensate lens aberrations, and such software must move the red, green, and blue components differently, because that's how photons actually behave. The theory of incomplete measurements can correctly model not just the clean, reversible transform from one spaceship to another in the vacuum of space, but also the blurry, dispersive, and lossy transform of a picture going through mist and fog. In earlier videos, we have established the relationship between propavectors and quantum mechanics. In this video, we established the kind of relativistic transforms that apply to propavectors, using the same kind of algorithms used in computer science to scale, rotate, zoom, or otherwise correct digital photographs. We end up with is a probabilistic quantum relativity, where nice and clean equations are replaced with algorithms operating on massive amounts of data. It's a good thing we already solved many of these problems incidentally, as a side effect of the market for digital photography and first-person shooter games, isn't it? Quantum relativity is not that complicated, but it requires massive amounts of computation that we simply cannot do without computers. This is the last high-level video. With that, you should now have a broad high-level understanding of what the theory of incomplete measurements is. There are many interesting details, however, which are addressed in the following videos in this playlist.